Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the series called Swamp Castle. I'm Rhombus Tix. I'll be reading several old stories to you in this series. Today I'm going to be reading Jeebers Mcjosephat. Captain Cracen knew that he only had a few minutes to live before the system deleted him. Purists back home would be horrified at his misuse of the special ammunition, but he had to break the siege somehow, and it was his own mind that he was playing with after all. He had to find an ally, and so far he hadn't had any luck. He walked through the poorer levels of Sundial Chicago, dodging in amongst the crowd of thralls. High up in the air, hoverdynes and constructs moved about under the glowing city shield. He could see the small blue circle in his right eye that told him he had little time left. Cracen was about to give up hope when he heard the music. Cracen had to stop a couple of times to avoid being run over in the grimy causeway. He ignored the cursing from the outraged drivers and went closer. Curious, he could smell blood and sweat and alcohol. Thus far, he'd been in the Confed Navy for 14 years, and he'd visited 100 different worlds. All of them had some things that never changed, except Federation worlds. All of them had some things that never changed. Even the Federation worlds. Especially the Federation worlds. The captain turned the corner, and he was disappointed at first when he saw Jeebers 2253. At first, Cracen thought it was just an interactive ad, but when he realized that someone had actually brain-aped the famous musician, he knew things were blatant here, but he'd never imagined they'd gone that far. Cracen walked in front of the musician, trying not to step on the whale rats that scurried around the pedestal on which the copy played. He waited patiently for Jeebers to finish the number and then said, "Nice piece." Jeebers smiled magnanimously. "Thanks, I appreciate it." "You lived here long?" Jeebers laughed at the word lived and shook his head. "Nah, I've been here for 5 years. Before that, didn't exist." Cracen nodded, keeping it casual. He looked around carefully and then said, "How's business?" "Lousy." "I can imagine." Cracen smiled and leaned against a pillar. "Listen, when is your shift on?" Jeebers stared at him like he was a little weird. "What do you mean? This is my box. One thing about busking is that it's usually free." Cracen laughed. "You'd be amazed. On some planets they charge you all kinds of things. Can I buy you a drink?" "You're kidding, right? Virtual drink, then. I have a proposal for you." Cracen waited patiently. Jeebers looked at Cracen for a few seconds, trying to assess him. "Sure." The door opened in the ether, and they left the pavement of brick and mortar for the glittering lights of a virtual cafe deep in the ether. They moved towards a shadowed corner. Of course, since the place didn't have to meet the strictures of normal reality, it had over 2,000 corners, all of them shadowed. Cracen took a small box out of his pocket and put it on the table so they could have a bit of privacy. "We can speak privately now," Jeebers smirked. "Well, that's nice." Cracen chuckled and shook his head. "That's not what I meant. What I mean is, well, let me put it this way. I won't be around much longer, and I need a favor. And I'm willing to pay handsomely for it." "How much?" "Well, how much do you want?" "I'm trying to save up for a body." Jeebers conjured a foaming beer and slammed it down. It didn't do anything unless he paid for the upgraded version, but it was nice social commentary. "I woke up here and found myself without a job or a body. Somebody leaked my brain tape." "Yeah, it happens sometimes." Cracen shook his head sadly. "Tell me about it. There ought to be a law." "Funny you should mention that," Cracen said, smiling enigmatically. "How much do you know about Federation politics?" "Nothing. They barely consider me a step above nested AI. I can get a body and citizenship if I pay for it, but at the rate I'm going, it'll take me about 1,000 years. Cracen nodded. "Great. You'll definitely be able to help me then." Jeebers frowned. Something about this didn't sound quite right. "Help you how?" "Can't tell you that. In fact, very shortly I'm going to cease to exist. But if you want to hear more, take this." He handed the privacy box to Jeebers. "What is it?" "It's a way for you to find me next time," Cracen said, checking his watch. Jeebers tried not to look stupid, but he sure felt that way. "Huh? I probably won't remember you the next time I see you, but if you..." And much to Jeebers' consternation, Captain Cracen disintegrated in a puff of pixels in the middle of the cafe. Now what was he supposed to do? Cracen stood at the helm of the CSS Beagle inside. They were running out of heuristic ammunition, and if he didn't succeed, it might cost the Confederation the war, and it would be his fault that billions would remain enslaved. "We have to get out of this," he murmured to himself. "I know, sir." Burbo was a loyal first officer. He wasn't very creative, but he knew his stuff, and this mission would have been a failure right from the start without him. "What am I missing?" Cracen looked at Burbo as he sat on this bridge overlooking the sea. The CSS Beagle was one of a kind. There were no other interstellar seafaring vessels in the Confederacy, or anywhere else, for that matter, that Cracen knew of. But tactics had changed once the Federation had invented the grav scrambler. Anti-grav was no longer a given fact of life, but until the Confed could come up with their own, and that was years away, they would have to try out of the ordinary methods. The Beagle had been a noble idea at first. Put a ship into the ocean waters and see if it could float on its own. Then the grav scrambler wouldn't do anything. But the ship's siege guns were only so useful on Sundial Chicago's shields. Sure, they would wear it down in a matter of months, but by then the Federation would have whipped up another one of those nested fleets and crushed them like insects. Cracen looked at Burbo and sighed. "Well, I can't think of anything." Burbo looked stricken. Hadn't the captain figured out how to land the ship? How to take care of this SC, quote, Navy, end quote? He wasn't about to let him give up now. "We should try one more time." We'll see. Fire up the guns. We'll give it one more go, and then we're done. We'll ram their shield if we have to." "Aye, aye, sir. Readying the cannon." Burbo yelled the mark into the nearest speaker, which then was echoed throughout the rest of the ship. "Fire when ready." How many times had he died inside of the city? Had the jury-rig worked at all? Cracen didn't know, but he was quite sure he would not be able to make another batch. This time it either worked, or he would have to think of something else. Jeebers looked down at Cracen, who was looking back up at him with some confusion. Jeebers smiled and kept playing. Either this guy was playing a joke, or he really didn't remember the conversation. Jeebers couldn't help but find a tiny bit of mirth in that. Maybe because someone in life finally had it worse than he did. Sense of humor. And what did that have to say about him? He finally finished his set. Now, no one donated any money. Of course, no one could afford it. This was the Thrill District. He stepped down off the podium and asked Cracen, "You looking for something?" "Yes." This might sound like an odd question, but have I spoken to you before? Jeebers looked him over closely. Maybe Cracen had expected someone to steal his avatar or something, but he had gotten pretty good at being able to tell the difference between someone connected to the ether and an independent construct like himself. Both of these guys were independent constructs. "No, you haven't." Cracen looked crestfallen. He shrugged and put a small amount of money into the hat. "Thanks just the same." The captain lingered a moment, looking intently around the area and at people as they walked by. None of them gave him the slightest bit of attention. Jeebers didn't have a gut anymore, but he had a memory of one. And his ghosty gut was telling him that Cracen was on the up and up. That, and he was the only person who bothered to give him any money at all day. "Wait," he said as Cracen started to wander off. "I lied. We have spoken before. Kind of." Cracen breathed a sigh of relief. At least, he looked like he did. Since neither of them had physical bodies, this wasn't really breathing or anything. "What did we speak of?" "Not much, really. You asked me about my business and gave me this." He handed the box back to Cracen. Cracen smiled. "Is there someplace more private that we can speak?" Jeebers laughed. "Sure. Same place when we went last time." Cracen thought, "Actually, is there someplace different?" Cracen looked thoughtfully a moment and then slightly confused. Then he said, "Yeah, sure, though it will cost us money. I've got money." "Why am I not surprised?" Jeebers chuckled. They disappeared and then reappeared in a featureless white room. "It's private and more or less unseen." Cracen smiled and said, "Well, we're more unseen than you think. I've got a few surprises up my sleeve. How much do you know about the siege the city is under?" "Well, I've seen a lot of soldiers, and I know that there's some boat out there and that a relief force is on the way." Cracen nodded. "Right, good. You know a whole lot of it, then. I want you to get the shield down." "Excuse me?" "I want you to take down the shield protecting the city." Jeebers couldn't help but think of the ancient opera Star Wars. Life really did imitate art. "And how exactly am I supposed to do that?" Cracen said, "If you can contact me on my ship, then we can send you the necessary files to accomplish everything you need." The problem is that the city is locked up tight. We can send data in, but we can't get it out. I don't have a clue that you exist back on my ship or what the situation is in here. If you can contact me, I know that we have an agent inside, and I can give you the tools that you need to accomplish it. Cracen took only a second. It was suicidal. He didn't want to die, but he didn't want to not live either. This whole thing was messed up, but he had to do something. What the hell? I accept. Cracen smiled. Great. Here is the code for my ship. What I need you to do is send a data package collect to the Electric Catfish Company on Loom. It's a neutral planet, and it's a front for Confed intel. Works for me. Cracen started to flicker in and out. He knew his time was running out. You seem to be taking this awfully well. Jeebers shrugged. I got nothing to lose. Cracen wasn't sure he wanted someone suicidal working for him, but he didn't really have much choice either. The fleet was going to be here in 3 days, and after that, his mission wouldn't really matter anymore. He sighed. I guess I haven't got anything to lose either, Jeebers said. One last question I have to ask before you fade away. Shoot. Doesn't it bother you that you're going to die? Cracen blinked for a moment. I don't understand. Well, you're telling me that the Federation of bad guys because they copy people like me and put AIs in things like toasters and pencils. But you're saying the Pentarian Confederation are good guys, and yet you're making copies of yourself that don't last long. Isn't that killing yourself over and over again? Are you religious, Cracen? Cracen continued to flicker. You know a lot more than you let on, he frowned. You're not ignorant of politics at all. I dabble. Cracen reached for his wrist to cancel the package that he'd given to Jeebers. He couldn't take the chance that he'd been betrayed. Ah, ha, ha, ha. I didn't say I wasn't going to help out. I didn't tell you everything, but just like you probably aren't. But I want a body. You can bet on that. Why are you flickering? You didn't flicker last time. Cracen murmured and lowered his hand again. I couldn't afford to take any chances. I tinkered with the self-deleting virus. I managed to give myself some more time. And that doesn't bother you? And does it bother you? Jeebers asked. Yeah, it does, but I had to do it. And I'd appreciate it if you don't say anything about it when the Confed wins. It'd be my career if they find out, Jeebers nodded. That's what I wanted to hear. Yeah, I'll help you. Cracen smiled and started to fade away. He had a look of sadness on his face, but peace as well, knowing that his short life had meant something. Right before he faded, Jeebers said, I didn't promise not to tell your bosses about you copying yourself, though. Us constructs have to stick together. Cracen frowned even more, but it could do nothing as he exploded into nothingness a final time. Jeebers felt slightly guilty, but not too guilty. He could be a bastard sometimes, especially for something he took so personally. Now he had to see about sending a message. Cracen dithered. He didn't want to ram the city, but they didn't have any more heuristic ammo. Without more justification indicating that there had been a success, he would have to bend to the will of his first officer, who now thought the whole thing was pointless. But if they rammed the city, they would lose the ship, and all projections showed that the odds of their success were minimal. What was the point of just wasting their lives? He wanted to wait until the last possible moment, and that was still at least a day away. Barrow had been patient, more than patient, but Cracen knew that the tide had turned, and yet, why couldn't he order the maneuver? The men were growing restless, but when he thought about it, he realized his gut was telling him something. So this was what the old woman had meant when she said some captains had it and some didn't. But what if he was wrong? Cracen didn't let his doubt show. He simply looked at Burbow's questioning glance and said, We wait a day. That's the most we can afford, and after that we do what we must. They didn't have any other choice, not if they didn't want to be to be cowards and condemn billions. Not one person on the ship would do that. Not now. Jeebers sent the package like Captain Cracen asked him to. All he could do was sit and wait. Theoretically, the package would fly across the universe in the blink of an eye as fast as the ether could take it. But it would still take time to process, and people in some circumstances didn't take a data package as seriously as the real thing, no matter how he marked it. He walked back to his usual stop for the post office. He felt ethereal enough as it was, but Cracen had been worse. Had it all been some kind of dream? All he had to remember Cracen by was the tiny stone that he was supposed to show the real Cracen if he showed up. Jeebers felt nervous. He stood on the ledge and began to play. It was what he always did when he was nervous. Someone stopped and listened to him play, then another person. Pretty soon a small crowd gathered around him. Something in his music had changed, and he could feel it, too. Jeebers played loudly and more boisterously. What was it? Hope? It was hope. Jeebers felt he had a chance to be alive again for the first time since he could remember. It was more than hope. It was joy, and that was a rare thing in the city. People had forgotten what good times were like since the siege began, and now they were interested all over again. The end was coming soon. It had been 19 hours since they fired the first shell, and already preparations were underway for the Beagle to ram the shield. The computer gave their odds at 10%, which, while the ultimate decision to commit was still 4 hours away, the necessary preparations had been going on for 2 hours. Cracen had tried to sleep and couldn't. His medical officer had threatened to force him to do so, but the look Cracen had given him had ended that nonsense right then and there. He was going to have to be awake for this, and while rationally he knew that he could perform better with sleep, his soul stirred and would not rest until the job was done. A type beam intercept caused a stir and brief cheer in the ether ops section as one of the ensigns motioned him to respond. The package had been received on Loon 10 hours ago, but the intelligence division hadn't known what to make of it. Cracen wanted to be angry, but he couldn't. At least, he couldn't be angry fairly. After all, his actions had been borderline legal at best. If he had informed them of his plans, they would have ignored him. As it was, all they knew was that there was an unknown agent inside the station willing to help the Confederation bypass the blockade. Even now, intelligence was sending a package to whoever he had found inside the city that was willing to help. Cracen didn't know who it was, and a part of him didn't care. Whoever or whatever they were, Cracen planned to keep any deals or promises other shadow selves had made before they were destroyed. It was the least he could do for them. Jeebers didn't know what to make of the box he received at his pedestal. It was small, it was black, and it was featureless, except for a single button marked open. What he did know was that he didn't want to open it on the street. He was reluctant to leave, though, because suddenly business was good. In fact, business was very good. If he stayed at this rate, he would be able to buy a body in 6 seconds. But he remembered the lean times in his old life way too much. Gigs came and went. Sometimes they were good, and sometimes they were bad. But you were going to get both. That and the fact that he really wanted to nail the people that just let him be booted up and then left him up to busk in a corner for however long it took to get a body. That just wasn't right. He finished his last set and waved to his new fans. He ignored their calls and inquiries about where he was going, and re-entered the privacy room. Vanishing in one and appearing in the other, he sat there, staring at the box for 10 minutes until he finally pressed the button. Instantly, a map of the city lit up. Several tendrils, like flowers, began to move out of the box in an exploratory fashion. At first, he thought it was beautiful, but that didn't last very long, as one of them wrapped around his head and started pulling him toward the box. He resisted with everything he had, but in the end, it wasn't enough. It pulled him all the way inside the box. Inside was a lush garden, filled with plants and insects of all kinds and descriptions, from at least half a dozen worlds. A beekeeper sat looking at him across the room and finally said, "So you're Jeebers Mcjosephat, huh?" Jeebers 2253, according to the Federation, he said. The beekeeper nodded, waving it aside as if it didn't matter. "And you want to help the Confed take down Sundial Chicago's shield?" "Yep." "And you're willing to do whatever it takes?" "Yep." "Even if it kills you?" the beekeeper asked, incredulous. "Well, I hope it doesn't, but I do think it has to be done." Jeebers looked nervously at one of the bees. The room was pretty realistic, and he didn't want to know if he'd feel the sting. "Is this room a construct, or are we in real time?" "Need-to-know basis. And while there's a lot you need to know, this isn't one on the list. Just say, 'I accept,' and we can be done with this." Jeebers looked at the bee in front of his face and at the beekeeper, but finally said, "I accept." The beekeeper smiled under his net, snapped his fingers. The bee stung Jeebers directly on his nose, and it did sting. A lot. Cracen yelled to all quarters of the ship as they prepared for war. The music was almost subsonic, but lively. The anthem meant something to everyone on the ship. It was the song they had picked to represent them on the roster, and it was the song that would be played if they won or if they failed. It was a series of notes that gave the Beagle a soul, just as much as any of her human symbiotes. Just because the Confederation didn't enslave or typically use AIs didn't mean they didn't mythologize or anthropomorphize. Indeed, they felt more need to do so because of that choice. One by one, the guns were loaded. One by one, the shield cartridges were recharged. The hoverbank was refueled because while she was an ungainly spaceship, if Sundial Chicago's grav scrambler device was taken down, then the battle was going to go into space where the city could barely touch the warship. The Beagle was the master of the sea and only a beggar in the skies, but even a beggar was much more of a match than a ground pounder. When the ship was ready, Burbo saluted the captain and said, "The Beagle is ready, sir." Cracen nodded. It was time. Either his agent would succeed, or they would go down fighting, but one way or another, their waiting was over. Full steam ahead. Aye, aye, sir. And the first blue water naval vessel in 300 years went to war. Jeebers knew a lot of things right now. His head felt swollen as he stumbled out of his private room with intimate technical knowledge of how to lower the shield or bypass security systems. He had heard that ether ghosts like him could still get drunk with the right drink, but he'd never been able to afford them. He'd only been able to afford the image and occasional taste, but he remembered what it was like to be high, and this was definitely similar. In a daze, he moved towards the looming gate before him. The local weather was set to rain, and the fog made visibility difficult, but the voices in his head told him that the most secure method would be this to do some good. Normally, he would never come to this part of town since pure ether ghosts were not tolerated here. Either you were a citizen of the Federation or you weren't. But Jeebers was able to blur his presence and make himself feel like static. 2 police officers watched him very closely, but the extremely deft money from nowhere in their accounts did the job nicely. He had to smile at that. Jeebers Mcjosephat, super spy. Cracen smiled as the Beagle ignored the artillery fire from the city's batteries. She was a well-armored ship, and none of these were going to get through. What worried him more were the planet's smart missiles. Thus far, they had eluded any attempt to counter them, and one of them would be enough to destroy a ship. It would cause ecological problems, but Sundial Chicago didn't seem worried about that at this point. Three of them headed and turned around towards the ship. Their increasing velocity meant that there was nothing to do to stop them, and then he had it. Activate hover drive. Burbo looked at him. Run? You're planning on running? You'll never make it. Cracen chuckled. I'm counting on that. The orders passed throughout the ship, and the stunned crew looked crestfallen. Had they come all this way for nothing? Slowly, monolithically, the Beagle lifted out of the water, first 10 feet, then 100, rising over the waves. As the smart missiles grew closer, Cracen continued examining his instruments. His smile grew wider and wider. It was going to be close, but they had a chance. The 3 smart missiles flew down over the water, leaving a valley 20 feet wide in their wake, turning around and gaining altitude. There was a sudden gray flash of light from Sundial Chicago as both the Beagle and the missiles found themselves crashing into the sea. The Beagle fell over 200 feet and for a moment lurched to the side, but after a short while righted herself. Reports of injuries were coming from all over the ship, but the Beagle herself was intact. The same could not be said about the missiles. Once they had lost their hover drive, they crashed into the water and sent shock waves out over 200 feet high. Burbo looked at Cracen and smiled. You knew. I suspected. The people who had their toy were quite proud of it the first time they used it to bring down a confid ship. I figured they were itching to try it again to destroy us, perform damage control, and get us moving forward within the hour. The enemy is in sight. Burbo nodded happily. Aye, aye, sir. Jeebers was able to walk through at least a dozen automated checkpoints. He was starting to get pretty cocky until he ran into the first actual living person. They weren't an AI either. His new sensors could tell him that, but they sure had a lot of nasty-looking tools. In the ether, he looked like a harmless technician of some kind, but he eyed Jeeber up and down as he walked by. He knew he didn't have time to change his appearance. He debated between walking by as if nothing was wrong or stopping. His gut told him to stop. Something wrong? Yeah, the technician said. What is it? Maybe I can assist you. We don't let AIs come in here. You're in a secure area. He put his hand on his belt. It was a small pouch, but Jeebers knew anything could be in there. He also knew that the technician could activate whatever it was much faster than someone could draw a gun. I'm not an AI. I'm a ghost. The technician relaxed a little, but not much. Why are you here? At this point, his memory searched through the files given to him, and he saw a few plausible excuses, but nothing felt right. I'm here to entertain the troops while the battle's going on. The technician said, why didn't they just pipe you through the feed? This time, the Confed files did help him. I don't know all of it. Something about Security barriers and feedback parameters? The technician nodded. Yeah, that makes sense. Take 2 lefts and then a right. First door on the right. Jeebers smiled. Thanks. The technician ignored him and murmured something to himself about the idiocy of entertaining the troops while a battle was going on. He walked on. Jeebers breathed a sigh of relief. The Beagle slammed up against the shield, but it wasn't doing so quietly. All her guns were unleashing angry plasma and rail guns against the barrier before it. Both cities had fusion engines that contained a tiny bottled sun, and theoretically could go for hundreds of years. Sundial Chicago had no weapons, but with the Scrambler, the Beagle had no shields, so the two of them continued to slug it out. But the city had power to burn. They were simply had nothing to spin it on or complete or competence to spin it with. All of the surrounding gunnery emplacements have been destroyed by the Beagle's artillery fire already. Burbo wanted to use a nuke, but Cracen wouldn't stand for it. We're going to take the city, and we're going to do it clean, and he meant to do just that. Jeebers found the shield control. Inserting the virus hadn't been that hard. He just took out a small, shiny red pebble and sent it into the virtual gears that maintained it. It took a few seconds, and suddenly the sky cleared to the natural brilliant blue-green instead of the dull yellow that the city had endured for 7 years. In fact, Jeebers had never actually seen it. It was pretty, actually. It wasn't as pretty as the large surgical shells that began to dissect the internal military apparatus of the city. One slammed right into the area he was currently in, causing the ether to flicker on and off. Jeebers was annoyed. Surely they had to have known he was here, or was the Confederation just using him? He wasn't going to stick around and find out. He began to run down the corridors. He couldn't door out because it was a secure area. The gaps in the shelling forced him to dodge and weave as sections of the floor were sent into the abyss. When a direct shell hit where he was, he thought he was done for until he found himself standing on board the bridge of the Beagle. He blinked in surprise and looked around. This was the real Cracen, and apparently he really was the captain after all. Jeebers smiled. Well, nice to meet you, Captain. Cracen smiled. Nice to meet you as well. According to our intelligence, you're the one that got our message? Jeebers remembered Cracen's request not to tell the others, and he could see that he was nervous. He wasn't going to spoil the moment, not yet, but that didn't mean he wasn't going to let Cracen get away with it. Yes, I did. I take it now that you're here, I get a body? Well, the idea is that all AIs get a body once the war is over. It's a lot of resources we can't afford right now. Jeebers tried to ignore the anger rising in him, the hypocrisy of it all. But the fact of the matter is, in your case, we'll make an exception. I don't think you realize just how many people you've saved. Cracen said and smiled. He stretched. If you'll excuse me, I've got a few more orders I need to give my men. The next few days were a blur. Jeebers was able to get a body, just as they promised. Some things sucked, like getting tired or getting hungry, but they were all worth it. He was able to eat and sleep again. The Confed military made short work of securing the city, and apparently they were able to turn the Federation fleet around. Some people were saying that the Battle of Sundial Chicago was the turning point of the war. Jeebers didn't know. He didn't care. He was happy to be alive, and he kept meaning to file that report about Cracen's abuses to his own mental copies, but he just didn't seem to get around to it. Maybe next month. So I found this story delightful. It is definitely an A-. It is also definitely something that I can work with. It's still not quite as good as Mr. Hamburger or Waiting for the Monsters to Die, which I give an A+ and an A respectively. Maybe even the reverse. I actually think Waiting for the Monsters to Die is the closest I'm ever going to come to a great story, but I still never sold it anywhere. So a little bit of background. The Pentarian Confederation is based on my first novel, which does share a universe with the second novel that you're listening to now. I'm not going to go into the extremely convoluted and psycho-complicated plot that is the first novel, but suffice to say that the Pentarians are basically genetic super beings who were created by a really bad person in a world that made copies of everybody on Earth in that copy. And then later, at the end of the first novel, everybody on Earth who's living has memories of all three of their lives, right? So their normal life, a life where the antagonist was God Queen, and then this fake fantasy world. So suffice to say that it really changed and screwed up humanity, even though they did eventually get to the stars. And I've written several stories. You may have even recognized a few of them when I talk about the Confederation or the Federation. And the Confederation is basically with the Pentarians, who do have advanced technology, but they don't share it readily. And you see a little bit about the loose organization of the Confederacy in the command structure of the ship, which I hadn't even realized was there. And I don't know if that was deliberate or unconscious, but it's a very nice touch. Versus the Federation that uses AI like Kleenex. The one story I didn't read, Wake Up Yulee, again about the sapient pencil, is also in the Confederation, or the Confederation setting. There's another one that I've written and read a while ago on the podcast called Molly and Mr. Missile, about a disarmed smart missile. I actually wrote that after. Molly and Mr. Missile took place after this story, whereas the pencil story took place before it. The thing I find interesting is I actually originally named this story, and let me make sure I'm getting this right, Manape Kulture. And I just have always remembered this story as Jeebers Mcjosephat. Except the thing is that the quintessential core detail of Jeebers Mcjosephat is not at all manifest in this story. The reason I say that is because the idea I had for Jeebers Mcjosephat is, what if you're one of the first people in the world who uploads your mind and it becomes public domain and everybody and their grandmother copies it? And I think that in an early draft of this story, I tried that and it just didn't work. And so I removed the public domain element and just made him somebody randomly abused by the Federation. Which is actually good, because I think that the original Jeebers Mcjosephat idea I had is a very good one. I still want to write that story, now that this story is apparently not at all based on that idea. But I will also say that that idea is one that needs to be an idea unto itself. In other words, the abuses of uploading a copy of your own digital intelligence, I only scratched the bare surface of in this story. The fact that Cracen cares about killing his duplicates is something that a society that values every iteration or every instance of the human mind as important. Because for all intents and purposes, Cracen is literally killing himself. Now, it's not as bad at the consent because he knows what he's doing, and there's not that much variance time-wise between his copies and himself. And I do firmly believe that a person has the right to end their own life, but never another's life, including another iteration of themselves. So their right to have laws against killing a copy of yourself, even a supposedly willing one. The other thing, however, is that, I am currently working on a story for Project NIMBY that does involve the abuses of uploading digital intelligence, but the focus of that story is on the consequences of eventually giving digital intelligences the right to vote. Because of course we would, right? If you're in a decent civilization and you recognize that a digital intelligence has has as much right to life or liberty as we do, then what would conservatives do to fuck that up? And this is what they would do. And I think it's a very, very horrific and very, very correct answer. And it's actually definitely so far the best story of that small 7-story anthology, which will eventually be on the podcast. Anyway, like I said, I enjoyed this story. It was fun to read, and I hope you enjoyed listening to it.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, at Amazon and other markets. RedAnvilCreative.com contains all our podcasts. Copyright
2022!
to fight the forces of evil!